Welcome, everyone. This is Finding Water in a News Desert. We're so happy you're joining us. As you get settled, we would love for you to introduce yourself in the chat, maybe share your name, where you're from. And then we've got a question for you. Do you feel you have the information you need to cast your vote in 2024? So this is Finding Water in a News Desert. Welcome those of you who are just now joining. Please introduce yourself in the chat and take a look at the question that we have on screen. We'd love to know kind of what the climate is in the area where you're living and in terms of finding information you need to cast your ballot. We'll get started here in just a few minutes. Give folks time to log in, say hi in the chat. It's like we have some folks from Chicago, Wisconsin, Wake Forest, DC. Great. Someone from Kentucky, I see, Benjy.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. If you're just now joining, welcome, welcome. This is Finding Water in a News Desert. Please feel free to say hello in the chat, introduce yourself, and answer this question. Do you feel you have the information you need to cast your vote in 2024? And we will get started here in just a minute. Great. Lots of great answers in the chat. And we will go ahead and get started. So welcome. This again is Finding Water in a News Desert, where we will be focusing on how to prepare for elections when news coverage is scarce. I'm Hannah Covington of the News Literacy Project. We are a national, nonpartisan education nonprofit building a movement to expand the teaching of news literacy in America. We help people learn to recognize credible information and news, and we have a ton of free resources. Some of those resources we'll be sharing in the chat today. So first, I just want to thank our panelists for their participation and lending their time and expertise today. I know we are in for a rich discussion, and we've set aside some time for questions and would love to hear from you who are tuning in. So if you have questions for any of our panelists today, please be sure to pop them in the Q&A box, and we will try to respond to as many as time allows. And just a reminder, our goal in this event is to foster a positive and a welcoming environment for everyone. So please be sure to keep the conversation in the chat respectful. If you're just joining, this is Finding Water in a News Desert. Please feel free to say hello in the chat. So I'm excited to be moderating this event tonight. My background is actually in local news, working for newspapers in Illinois and Oklahoma. Like a lot of people, I grew up in a town in a rural area that had a vibrant local newspaper where we turned for important information. But today, that paper is definitely a shell of what it once was. So, in thinking about the topic for tonight's discussion, I'm definitely thinking about my family, I'm thinking about my friends, and I'm thinking about the millions of people who will be heading to the polls this fall for some hugely consequential local, state, and federal elections. Many of those people living in areas with little to no access to quality news and civic information. So, this is what we want to talk about tonight with a focus on some practical and actionable tips and guidance and where to go for critical election information. Before we begin, I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists. First, we have Benjy Hamm. Benjy is the director of the University of Kentucky's Institute for Rural Journalism and Community Issues, which researches trends, issues, and ideas in rural journalism and gives advice and workshops for professionals. Benjy is also a veteran newspaper editor and has led news operations in Kentucky as well as in South Carolina. Also joining us is Brianna Lennon. Brianna is the county clerk for Boone County, Missouri. Before she was elected to that office in 2018, she served in the Missouri Attorney General's office and was also the Deputy Director of Elections in the Missouri Secretary of State's Election Integrity Unit. Brianna also co-hosts the award-winning podcast High Turnout Wide Margins, which covers issues for election administrators and gives insights into the election processes for voters. It's definitely a podcast I'd highly encourage everyone to check out. And finally, I'd like to introduce Alana Rocha. Alana leads the Rural News Network, and it's a resource hub for newsrooms who are members of the Institute for Nonprofit News. Alana works with more than 75 network outlets in 47 states to amplify coverage from rural areas. And before that, she was a longtime news and politics journalist in Florida, Kansas, and in Texas. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
To begin, I'd like to start with a question that all the panelists can weigh in on. I think it's useful to start with some basic definitions. Some people might not know, for instance, what a county clerk does, Brianna, or how journalists go about covering elections. So in elections, my question is, what role should journalists play? And then what about election officials? Benjy, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Alana and then to Brianna.
Sure. So in a lot of cases, we're looking to journalists for trusted news and information. We get information from a lot of different sources, and today more than ever, but it's not always reliable. It's not always by people who have experience doing these things. And so as we're looking for journalists providing information, what we hope and expect is that they're going to provide trustworthy information that helps you become a much better informed voter. And one of the issues with that then is if you're in a news desert, that's harder to do. And a lot of people will say they get their news from phones or whatever. There's a recent survey that said 16% of people say they get their news from Google or search engines. But the question is, where does the search engine get that information from? And it's, in many cases, it's a journalist. Where does your phone get that information from? Your phone's not covering City Hall. It's a journalist often who's doing that. So that's what we need at this time of year. So,
Alana, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, as far as how journalists should be covering, I hate the word should because I don't want to put it on anybody. Each community is different. But what I found after my 10 years at the Texas Tribune, obviously politics and policy is their bread and butter there, is that less of the horse race, more of the context. And sure, the Tribune and others do well, as many of our local newsrooms do, especially in these rural communities, getting these candidates and local officials to sit down for an interview and be able to answer questions from the people that they serve. I think that's very worthwhile as far as, the people who elected them having to, face those who they serve. But also just the context of, rather than just covering sound bites and, going back and forth on the attacks or the propaganda, putting things into context on what they mean in a bigger picture, or what redistricting has done in some of these areas as far as, that the elections were settled in the primaries well before November, things like that, I think add real value to, voters and knowing as they walk into the polls and what to expect.
That's great. I think you've raised some important characteristics of what responsible local journalism looks like. Benjy, you raised the point of what happens though when there is no local journalism in an area where someone's living that's credible. But Brianna, I wonder if you could speak from an election official's perspective. What's your role in an election?
I think my role in an election is to make sure that voters have what they need in terms of the logistics of voting. Different states vary on how much candidate information clerks can put out. Some states want voter guides to go out from county clerks and Secretary of State's office. Some say that is campaigning, and so it can't be done. In Missouri, that's true. We can't send out anything about candidates. So all that we can really put out is who the candidates are and how to contact them. And then usually it's the advocacy organizations, campaigns, and local newspapers that put out the information about what the candidates believe and what they plan to do and why they're running. So they're the vital portion of it for education about what's on the ballot, but for how to register to vote, how to be an eligible voter, where you vote, what time you vote, all those different things. That's what we have available to us. But most of us, there's a really good survey that was done that I think it's something like 80% of the voting population is served by 20% of the total number of local election authorities, which means that they're in urban areas. And then the 20% of voters that are not covered by urban areas, which are usually rural voters with very little news coverage, are served by 80% of the county clerks, because we're so hyper localized and decentralized that it may be that there is a clerk that is serving only 4,000 voters somewhere, and their office is just them and somebody else part-time. So they may not have a website. They might not be able to put out that information. And so they're relying on whatever they have available in their local news market to put out information about even their core information when polling places are open, all those. And the mail. We rely a lot on the mail, which is also its own issue.
So thinking about election officials using local news to kind of communicate important information about the electoral process, about who's running, when they can go to the polls, that kind of thing. There was a question in the chat that I do want to highlight, and that's, what if you live in a news desert? So the title of the event is, finding water in a news desert. Benjy, could you define for us what is a news desert? And can you talk about just kind of what type of crisis are we facing in local news, especially in rural areas?
Sure. Essentially, it means that it's an area that is not served by a news outlet. So it's a phrase that's been popularized by Penny Abernathy, who was at Northwestern University. She's done some excellent work with this, just looking across the country to try to determine what the number of news outlets are, where they are, and are there places that aren't served by news outlets. Tim Franklin at Medill Northwestern is doing excellent work with it as well. And so in their latest report, there are about 250 counties in the United States that don't have a local news outlet. And that's important, and generally those are in rural communities. But another significant number to that is that in 1,600 counties, roughly 1,600 out of the 3,100 in the United States, are only served by one news outlet. In almost every case, even in today's world, that's still a newspaper. So, there's a few online-only news sites in those communities, but for the most part, it's a newspaper that is still providing that information, but it's the only outlet they have. And so they're at risk. We still have more than 6,000 newspapers in this country, and we have a number of really good online-only news sites and other things. But particularly in rural areas, we're at risk that if one newspaper goes out in a community, that means all their local journalists are gone in that community. And so as we're looking at the 1,600, one concern with that is some of them are actually what is known as ghost newspapers, which mean they have a title, they're distributed, but they may or may not have any staff. They may be operated from another place, particularly larger chains might operate it from another place. There may be an editor who lives 30 miles away. And these are being published and still sent out, but they're really not providing the type of local news that we would want and expect for those communities. So it's a very real issue, a very serious issue right now, particularly not just for elections, but democracy, period. There are a lot of concerns that when in areas with low or no local news coverage, the voter turnout is reduced. You have more issues with the funding and financing with local government and other things. So a lot of social issues that occur as a result of that too.
Alana, can you kind of pick up there? I would be interested to know from your perspective, what is Benjy mentioned a few, lower voter turnout, higher government spending. What's the impact of the decline in local news? When a newspaper is downsized to be a ghost or a shell of its former self, or it closes altogether, what happens in local communities?
Yeah, this came up in a meeting recently with one of our 78 newsrooms in the Rural News Network. It was an outlet about 50 miles outside of Eugene, Oregon. And they said when their local paper closed there, that the city council all of a sudden started meeting behind closed doors for the entire meeting and doing a lot more behind closed doors because nobody was watching. And so a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who happened to call that town home founded Highway 58 Herald. Unfortunately, he fell ill about a year in, and the business community, not journalists, picked it up and kind of are learning as they go. But they just saw the importance of having a local paper there. We saw it in Uvalde here in Texas, with the horrific shooting there 2 years ago. Of course, the Texas Tribune, former employee there, but they cover the whole state. But the fact that there wasn't, they had a Uvalde newspaper and things like that, but with all eyes on that community afterwards, there was accountability. And so I think you see that, and why you see so many of particularly the newsrooms I work with founded by journalists or just concerned citizens wanting a good honest news source for the community when the local paper closes up. And of course ours are all nonprofit, and the reason we kind of focus on rural is because obviously there are fewer people in rural America, and that's less philanthropic capital to support them. And so, it's a unique group, but very much needed.
I think too about social cohesion and community building of a local news source. Growing up, looking for my siblings' names in the local sports coverage, or my name for perfect attendance, and that the paper was where we saw when there were road closures or what was going on at City Hall, just providing this kind of shared understanding of what's going on in a community where you can vote who's running. And I wonder, Brianna, if you can jump in and talk about how does this decline of local news outlets impact your work, impact the work of election officials, and how you communicate with constituents and voters?
Yeah, I think there's really two major ways that it's really been obviously a detrimental shift to losing our local newspapers. And one is that oftentimes we are statutorily required to put out information like sample ballots, polling place locations, hours, and stuff like that in our local newspaper. And whether that is a welcome thing or not, a lot of the areas, like we have 114 counties in Missouri. We obviously do not have that many newspapers, which means that when you're in a large rural county, you may have the same newspaper circulation as your 3 adjoining counties. And so when you put your information into the paper, they put theirs into the paper, the other 2 counties put theirs in. It's very hard for voters to sift through all of that information to get anything useful out of it, because it's not always pertinent to them. And so that can cause a lot of confusion, just like when there are media markets in TV. It's incredibly confusing for voters, and we get those calls all the time when people say, well, so-and-so said early voting's happening. Like, yeah, they're in a market where their county clerk does have early voting open on Saturday, but our office is much smaller and we don't have it open on Saturday. And a lot of that has bred some of the mistrust that we're seeing. So it's like this vicious cycle. And the other thing is that when we do have important imperative information to put out, COVID was a great example. So many election rules changed in 2020 during COVID. And I, fortunately, my particular county, although the surrounding areas would be considered a news desert, I at least have the University of Missouri in my backyard. So there is no shortage of journalism students that want to cover what's going on. And I had basically a journalist embedded with me the entire day for the November 2020 election. And so when information needed to get out, I had somebody to put out information for me. And that was really wonderful, but that is very much a rarity. And so what it ends up doing is not even just not providing the information to voters, but providing what ends up being very confusing information to voters, which makes them frustrated and less likely to engage in the whole process.
Or trust the process. You mentioned the role of trust. I wonder if we can kind of camp here for a second. How has declining trust in institutions impacted your work both as journalists and as election officials? How are you working to maybe build or rebuild some of that trust? So this is for all of you. Benjy, let's start with you.
So one of the things we know about trust is it's declined substantially. But I'm troubled a little bit by the questions a lot of times, because it says, do you not trust media? And it's like the same questions, people tend to trust the media that they trust. And that seems simplistic, but but a lot of these are, when people do this, and I've asked people who do these questions, someone who's answering that question may be thinking Fox News or MSNBC. They may be thinking opinion. They may be looking at different things. And a lot of times what people complain about or don't trust are outlets they don't watch and they don't read. So they say they don't trust X, Y, and Z, but if you ask them, they haven't looked at it in years. I'm not saying there's not a trust issue, but I think the whole question needs to be redefined. And would be better if you asked, do you trust your local news outlet? Do you trust, which outlets do you trust? And what we see is that across the board, both in surveys, research, and in just person on the street encounters, is that people tend to trust their local news source more than they do national or regional. It's the same question if people who have trouble, have issues with education, but they love their local school. They don't like the legislature, but they like their local representative. So we see that play out in a lot of different ways. So, the idea of trust is a real concern, but I think it's a place by place thing. And I think one of the reasons that people have, for a decline in trust is news people have not, particularly newspapers, have not done a good job of explaining what they do and why. They haven't been transparent in the decisions they make, and people are doing better today than they were, but there's still a long way to go to help the audience understand. We just assume that people understand why we cover certain things or why we don't cover certain things. And the reality is they don't. They don't have the same experience or judgment, and it doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It just means they don't understand a lot of times what we're doing and why. So we need to do a lot better job of explaining, our approach to journalism, how journalism's different than what you would see on social media or how it should be, and the fact that we make mistakes. We make, and own up to them when those things happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of these decisions and practices can feel invisible and mysterious to people. I think it's Joy Mayer at Trusting News who says, as journalists, we've actually been pretty bad at telling our own story of how we produce and report the news. Alana, do you have anything to add on this idea of trust?
Yeah, I one of my lofty goals for the Rural News Network is to help close that trust gap. Like you said, Benjy. I mean, maybe national or regional aren't liked because they're not up close. There's a premise or a program in Wichita that has, where I once worked, but it was a national story a few years back, where they have a wait list for this program that basically they bring people from polarizing backgrounds or different sides of an issue to the same table. And the whole premise is it's hard to hate up close. And I think back to when I started in rural America in Hays, Kansas, circa 2004, when the media wasn't maybe the same media, that ominous term, but that people would see me in the grocery store and I was Alana Rocha on air. I wasn't this, person that didn't have their best interest in heart or my community, at heart. And so I think that with these people and these newsrooms in the community, or these people in the community, I call them resident reporters, because they're in the communities they cover. They're not parachuting in. They respect their neighbor and can kind of really detail the nuances of those communities, not like others can, especially those that maybe just fly in and then boom, they're on a live newscast in the evening. That's not to knock it. I've been in that position too. and they're fast learners, but at the same time, they don't know those intricacies of the communities they cover. And so I think just being present in these communities, and like I said, going back to that story where the local paper closed and all of a sudden the city council started doing everything behind closed doors. Just kind of lifting the veil on how they're doing it. Sometimes those reels of a reporter talking about how they're going to approach something or how they're going to go about reporting something goes a long way, just to kind of tell people how they do their job rather than leaving the viewers to assume how they do it.
Brianna, I'd love to hear from you. You kind of mentioned in your last answer this vicious cycle that happens when, the information isn't what people are really needing or is confusing in some way, and that exacerbates the trust problem. What have you seen in your work when it comes to trust?
Yeah, I think very similar to what Benjy was discussing about the kind of the journalism world telling its own story. We have had the exact same conversation in the elections world for the last 4 years. And there's a lot of really great journalism work that has come out of that, because with the absence of having local news to be able to explain how elections work, because they have their own constraints for what they have time to cover, they can't go in depth into how we're running elections. And that is completely understandable. But then on the local election side, when we're trying to administer things, it gives us limited places where we can put information to explain how things are, because we can't take out ads. We can't go on TV. So, I mean, we can go on TV if somebody wants to cover us, but that's pushed a lot of us onto social media, and that's great. I mean, we have plenty of us that have pretty robust social media presences, but when that ends up competing against local news, because we're simultaneously telling people don't trust what's on social media, think critically about it, but we're going to put our information there because we know you're there, it makes it difficult. And I don't know if that has really moved the needle at all on trust. It's something that there are agencies all over the country that are kind of pulling together local election officials specifically to try to boost the signal on that. But again, going back to what Benjy was saying, everybody says they trust their local county clerk, but then you don't trust the Secretary of State, and you don't trust that other state over there that's doing shady things that I don't know anything about. And so we've had our own conversations internally about us not saying that anymore. It used to be really easy for county clerks to just say, well, I can't tell you what's going on over there, but let me tell you how we do it here. And people would say, oh, thank goodness, this is so wonderful. With so much national news, all they hear about is what everywhere else is doing. And so they don't care that we have assured them that what happens here is fine, because they're not actually worried about their own vote. They're worried about everybody else's vote. So local news lets us at least put that out and put out a better message than we used to have, which is, here is how elections work across the board. Yes, we're decentralized, but here are the things we have in common. And here are all of the ways that we are making sure everything is above board and has integrity and is accurate.
I'd like to focus on kind of the practical side of this. Very basic, stepping back here. If someone is living in a news desert or in an area where it's hard to access credible news, civic information, how can people, first of all, find out what's on their ballot? Folks have been sharing some ideas in the chat. Brianna, I wonder if you could start there.
Yeah, if you are fortunate enough to be in a place that has a county clerk website, I can pretty much guarantee you there's a sample ballot on the county clerk's website. One of the difficult things is educating people that county clerks, usually county clerks, could be county recorders, could be a board of elections, but a local entity is who has that information. Because most of the time they're going straight to the Secretary of State's office, and the Secretary of State's office may say, that's local elections. We don't have any of that stuff. All I can tell you is the federal candidates. So reaching out to your local election authority, many times you'll get them mailed to you. And I can't tell you how many times I hear, Oh yeah, that sample ballot. I know I got that. I didn't open it, but I got it. And we send out 100,000 of those to every registered voter for every election. And I know it's useful for the people that open it, but we do try to at least get that information out there. So in terms of finding out what's on the ballot, the actual government website and the mail are the two biggest ways that people are going to find them.
Just as a quick follow-up, Brianna, and then I'd love to hear from Benjy and Alana from kind of a journalism perspective. We've seen, you mentioned election officials are on social media trying to get the word out about different pieces of information. We've seen one common trend in disinformation, especially around elections, is bad actors who are posing as that information is coming from election officials, maybe things like robocalls about polling times and places, text messages, mailers that may be misleading. How can people verify that something they receive in the mail, for example, or they see on the government website is actually coming from an election official?
So if you are looking at mail or email, the biggest things to look for are whether it has an election mail insignia on it, because it literally just has big words that say election mail. You can only use those if you are a government office. So if it has that on it, it is illegal if it is not from a government office. So that's the first thing to look for the mail. The second thing is be very critical of anything that you receive in your email or your mail that says a return address of the county clerk or whoever your local election authority is. Because what a lot of these groups do is send pre-filled out things or return envelopes and put our name and address on it, which makes it look like it came from us. But if you look at the actual mailer, the mailer very clearly says who it's from. And I hate to throw anybody under the bus, but Voter Participation Center is very bad about this. And we get those every year. They will send mailers out and it looks exactly like they're trying to make it look like it's from a government office. And then we get voters that call and they're upset about it because they think that we did it. And then on websites, the things to look for, I know that we're not all on .gov yet, but we are all trying to get to a .gov. So that's a good way to make sure that you're on an official government website, is if it has a .gov in it. And the other is just to look at it and see if there are other county offices on the website, because county clerks are only one part of larger county government. It's not often that they have their own standalone website, even if they are a small community. So look to see that there's validating information on other parts of county government, like collector's office and bill paying and recorders of deeds and all of that.
Okay, so election mail insignia for things that are coming in the mail. Be skeptical of return addresses. Websites, look for .gov, look for what is around that page on the website. It shouldn't just be, like an isolated one-off county clerk's page. Great tips. Benjy, Alana, I wonder from a newsroom perspective, how are newsrooms in rural areas approaching this election cycle and trying to get information to the people who need it?
Well, one of the things that is, as we go back to the idea of news deserts and other things, one of the difficulties is that many of these places are less staffed than they were even in 2020. So that means providing even the same amount of information can be difficult. So that's the bad side. The good side is that a lot of them are embracing more with their websites, their social media presence and other things, and trying to get information to people and to promote what they're doing in a way that lets people know that it's available. One of the things I think is crucial, though, for this is to understand that a lot of people tune into elections around October. And yet in, the legislatures and the people doing the redistricting maps have gotten unbelievably precise at making sure that a lot of the races aren't contested in November. So one of the important things is for journalists to remember that a lot of the local elections, particularly for state house and other things, are actually being decided in the primaries. They're not going to the November election. And if you wait to do your big promotions and your voter guide and everything else, then a lot of times I'll look at ballots and depending on the area, more than half the races in November are just uncontested, or it's unlikely that one side or the other is going to win, and that's by design. They've done the lines that way. Now, for local elections, that can be different, particularly for nonpartisan elections. But as they're doing that, one of the things that I think they're doing better at, but there's still a lot more room, is to actually promote the sites that aren't owned by them. So the elections officials and other places try to refer people to information. They don't have to provide all of that information, but if they show readers where that information is, then and help guide them on, to these paths, that's very helpful as well.
Alana, do you have anything to add? I'd love to hear, anything on the local journalism front. And then I'd love to hear, how can people maybe be thinking like journalists if there aren't journalists in their area?
Yeah, those are good questions. I know because we've been sampling our members that we have about, again, 78 newsrooms, almost 40 of which are either putting out voter guides already or plan to ahead of November. Again, as you pointed out, Benjy, many of, especially here in Texas where I am, many of the elections, the key was the primary. November's kind of a formality. And so it's really great that they're taking the time, and they've seen such engagement with their communities. Users and audience members in these communities see it as news they can use. And so that translates to subscribers or perhaps donors, because many of the nonprofits, diversify their revenue source. It's not just ads, it's not just philanthropy, membership, products, things like that. And so they've really, seen the engagement that they want with the community by putting out this news. But other ways, as far as thinking like a journalist, I always say diversify your sources. You League of Women Voters, many people are plugging in the chat, I see, and I've relied on them for elections myself, in addition to the Tribune or whatever my news source has been. But yeah, diversify your sources. Go to the person's website, see what they have to say. Go to, League of Women, go to your local news, go to the elections office. I realize that especially in rural areas, internet isn't as prolific or strong sometimes, the broadband signal, to do all that. But then you have printed versions, maybe at the local diner or, local library. And so there's different ways to seek it out. The issue is that we're all so busy and we don't have the bandwidth to do that and really scrutinize a source or look at the details of whether it was a paid placement or whatnot that can be sneaky and not as forthcoming as it might seem. And so that's where it's a matter of finding bandwidth and the will to want to do it, which isn't easy in this day and age when we're doing all the things all the time.
You mentioned sneaky tactics. I feel like this is a great segue into something we know as pink slime. Benjy, can you tell the folks here, what is pink slime? What's it trying to do, and how's it maybe trying to trick people?
Well, it's a term that's used for websites that are essentially trying to fool the audience into thinking that they're valid and legitimate news sources, and oftentimes they're created in mass quantities in different areas, and it's been going on for years. I remember probably 10 years ago noticing that every community, when I was with Landmark Newspapers, we had about 70 news papers and online sites across the country. And at one point, I noticed almost every one of them had this this site, and they were they were publishing information, and sometimes they were even publishing Associated Press material, but it was just these odd sort of things that had occurred, and they would come along and then disappear and come back, and it's so easy to do. It's so easy to create them. Now, what I don't know is, how much they're read and whether, they're, how much impact they have. And that would be of interest. But it's designed to try to fool people. And just as the mailers are designed to try to fool people with the return address and other things, we've seen it. Some people have created newspapers just for election season. And we've had that in markets where I worked previously, where somebody would create a newspaper for 3 months. Now, that was legitimate. I mean, they created a newspaper, but it was a front to promote certain candidates. And so one of the things you want to look for on those is a lot of them are done sloppily. A lot of them aren't updated regularly, and they have a sort of different look and feel if you spend a lot of time. And as Brianna said, you know, I think the word we can keep using here is skepticism, of just being skeptical about what you see, you know. And if it, you know, if it looks close to, you know, if it says local news, you know, whatever, but it doesn't sound like anything familiar to you, then it's probably not legitimate. You know, and it, you know, at the risk of offending the few people that might be legitimate in those communities, you know, that's a good way to start. Now, one thing I would say though is, again, in communities, in smaller communities, it's easier to recognize these types of things, I would think, you know, because you know what the local news organization is, but people still get fooled regularly by them.
Yeah, I wonder, you know, thinking about the rise of generative AI, there is a lot of concern over creating misinformation at scale, including pink slime type websites in an effort to shape people's views heading into the election. We have a good question from the audience I wanted to pose here. This is from Sarah in the Q&A, who says, speaking of ghost news, are you seeing or observing a phenomenon in which someone is starting a news website that has entirely AI generated content? Has anyone observed any trends in AI when it comes to election information or misinformation?
I haven't seen that, but I have encountered skepticism among the outlets I work with. You know, when we've tried to, you know, introduce some elements of AI as far as maybe generating a summary from a story, but nothing goes out until a human has looked at it to make sure, you know, what was generated is legit and accurate. I haven't seen an entire site generated by AI, but I wouldn't be surprised if several exist. But I just know, because there is so much question around it, especially with images and video now, and all the stuff that they can do in addition to text. You know, there's just a lot of hesitancy to use it, even if it makes some jobs easier. But again, always with that human on it before it goes to publish.
I've not seen it either, and like with Alana, I don't doubt that it's there somewhere, but I'm not familiar with it. It's easy to do, but also, you know, I was here one time and my nephew created a fake story and put it as if it were on a CNN website, and then sent that to someone else as a joke. And he did it in about 10 minutes. And it had to do with a national park being closed that this person was going to, and the next day. And the person reacted thinking that the park was closed, and it was all a big joke. But the thing to me was, it took 10 minutes and it fooled the person initially. And it wasn't even all that well done if you looked at it closely. But that initial reaction and lack of skepticism made the person react in a way. So it's, you know, I think that's one of the issues with the technology, is it works wonderfully in so many ways, but it does make it a lot easier for bad actors.
Well, and that's a great example too, to just, you know, do the extra step and go straight to the legit website for that national park to see that it in fact isn't closed. But yeah, that initial reaction sometimes is what sticks with people. And when you're talking about voting and going into the booth, that might be the memory or, you know, picture of whatever candidate you associate with that name. So that's, yeah,
Brianna,
good.
did you have something that you wanted to add?
I was going to add that it's also something that we talk about significantly in our local election authority world, because there are concerns that, I mean, we see misinformation on maybe not even things that would be considered pink slime, but things that are not being vetted nearly as well as they should be. And there's a couple of them that come to mind that I would probably get sued from them if I said any, but one of them is located in Missouri and writes a lot of articles about Maricopa County, Arizona, and is treated like a newspaper in many ways, but does not act like one. And we often get people sending us information, complaints and allegations from other places that they use these articles as proof of how they know that something bad happened or that there's fraud somewhere. And so we're watching the AI development very carefully, not because we can do very much about it, because we're not really in a position to do very much about it, but because that's only going to exacerbate what we're already seeing.
Are there any other trends when we think about getting closer to the general election, things people should be watching out for as they're sifting credible from less credible information? Any trends that folks should be aware of, or anything that they should expect to see that we haven't covered yet?
I think there's going to be a substantial, and we saw that in Texas, a substantial investment in misleading mailings. There were a lot of Texas officials who their communities were being bombarded with information about them. In many cases, I mean, to call it misleading would be, the beginning of it. I mean, in many cases, it was so far away from the truth that that people didn't recognize themselves. And I think that's being replicated in a lot of states around the United States. The other thing I think that's troubling at the same time is all of this is occurring at a time where people are looking at social media, but a recent Washington Post story about Facebook is that they're actually reducing the number of or the opportunities for people to get news, and particularly election news. And so a lot of sites are seeing reductions in traffic referrals from Facebook of 50 to 75%. So in this absence of getting information from the traditional news outlets, then what fills that gap? And Facebook says we don't want to be in that, and our audience doesn't want to be those things. And then you have Google doing some things, in particular reacting to the California proposed law and then shutting down some referrals to news sites as well. So you're having this combination of creation of news deserts, people using social media in different ways and thinking that's where they're getting news, and these larger tech companies actually reducing the amount and referrals for the legitimate news sources. So I think that's going to be a troubling issue going forward.
Right. Brianna, any trend that you would like to touch on that we haven't talked about yet?
I think you covered them.
Yeah, I was thinking, Benjy, as you were talking, if people are turning to Facebook or Threads after Meta's made this very public declaration that they're not trying to make these newsy platforms, it's like, where will they find what they need? We have some really good questions from the audience that I'd love to get into. This one, Alana, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So this is a question from Steve. Steve writes, wearing both my editor and League of Women Voters hats, we're constantly faced with the challenges of candidates who will not talk to local media or participate in forums because they, quote, don't trust media organizations they believe are against them. It makes it difficult to give people information on candidates. How do we beat this?
You still publish the story with the one candidate, and you make it clear, that the other candidate didn't participate, and you maybe point people to their website as far as where they stand on different issues that you would have liked to have asked them about live. Oftentimes, here in Texas, where my politics experience is the deepest, When we were covering elections, obviously not a lot of the lawmakers or the candidates rather debated. And so we, as a multimedia team, came up with a series called Split Decision, where we interviewed both of the candidates. And in COVID, it was, like this via Zoom. But, we would interview them in person prior to that and afterwards. I'm asking them the same set of questions as if they were on the same stage, and then we edited it together. So people, our audience could get an idea of where they stood on issues, important to the voters, we thought, and then we would ask a funny or silly question at the end because it's video and you want to keep the audience. But that's a way we went around it, because we didn't have debates to cover, because again, many of the races are shored up in the primary that, maybe the Republican candidate, which, are the majority here in Texas, didn't see a need to have to, put their life on the line, or their candidacy rather on the line, to debate their candidate that really didn't have a chance. But that's still a way to serve, the audience and enlighten them ahead of the polls.
Please feel free, if you haven't submitted a question yet, but if you have a question for our panelists, keep those questions coming. This one is from Rebecca. Rebecca says, I am the editor of the e-newsletter of the League of Women Voters of Georgia. I correct fallacies over and over. I talk about the integrity of our vote in the face of multiple audits and recounts, but I feel like I'm talking to the converted. News is sorted like everything else. We choose the news we consume that reinforces biases we already have. How do journalists and editors counteract that? So maybe Benjy or Alana, do you have thoughts for Rebecca?
I think it is a very serious issue, because a lot of people are doing their sourcing, and that's why I go back to this idea of trust. A lot of them trust their own sources, even if those sources are not trustworthy, but they feel like they trust them. I think one of the big issues, I talk to the students all the time about oppositional reading, of trying to seek out information that might go against what you're thinking or your beliefs or whatever. I wish we could bring that more for the larger audience, because I find that it tends to be going the other way. And to Alana's point, a lot of elected officials or candidates don't feel like they need to be participating with the news outlets, because they are going to their own audience using their own social media or websites or whatever. I find the whole idea of trying to persuade people who have a closed mind to be frustrating, but I'm not sure. I still remain optimistic that there are groups of people who, presented with information, will make good decisions. But there are core people who have already decided who they're voting for in the primary and in the general election, and that is either someone with an R beside their name or a D beside their name, even if they have no idea who that person is.
One more question, and then I'd like to kind of pose a final question for the panelists. So this is an audience question from Chris. Chris writes, today was the last day of 2 local community newspapers in my rural area, over 125 plus years old. We are trying to come up with some kind of local newspaper of some sort. How does one try to get local information, accountability for all our local news? There are several people who want to do something, but what can one do as citizens without the money?
Several have gotten, creative, especially with technology being what it is, either, starting a newsletter or, there are courses that INN, Institute for Nonprofit News, where I work, offers if people are looking to either convert a weekly into a nonprofit or, start a nonprofit and what that takes. So there are resources out there to go about it, but I just think you have to build the audience and engage the audience and, have them kind of along for the ride, because you can't just serve them blindly, not knowing what they need or what they want. And I think the more upfront they are about it, the better. But yeah, I'm happy to connect you. or those in your community with people that we've, helped, or that, already having newsrooms. But like I said, many of ours are 1 and 2 men shops with a freelance budget. Some less than that. One other idea is Connect Arizona comes to mind, where Marixa there, she just started it by a WhatsApp group during the pandemic. And from there, it grew to thousands and thousands of people looking for valid information in Spanish about the pandemic. And with that, bore a publication that's now a member of INN and doing quite well. So sometimes, kind of meet people where they are, I would say. And whether that's a WhatsApp group or, the local library, wherever people are gathering and, where they go to for sources of information, I'd say start there.
There's one last question that came in that's great. I don't want to skip it really quick. So this question is, really small elections, school boards, et cetera, can often be incredibly impactful, but also incredibly hard to find information on. In my community, if local news covers them at all, it's usually just a list of names, perhaps with basic credentials at best. Candidates for this type of election often don't have a web presence beyond some basic platitudes about wanting to serve the community, nothing about actual positions on issues. Do you have any tips for getting information about these elections despite this?
And that's a great point too, because a lot of times the websites will be the platitudes. It'll be just, we're all in favor of this being a great community and I love the community. And so you're really trying to look for specifics. It's difficult if there's no news organization, there's no, people aren't doing things on websites. And if, in some communities, as one of the chat things points out, is in some of these communities, it's difficult to have internet access. What I would say is that one of the ways that you can do that is to find sort of opinion leaders or trusted people. I don't have any idea when the judges are on the ballot every year in Kentucky. I have no idea who most of those people are. So I call friends who deal with the court system, whether it's, an attorney or other things. I talk to teachers about school board members and other things. And so trying to get information, if there's not a news outlet, who are the trusted people in your community? And their views may be biased. They may not have the exact same views you do, but it's a good way to get information. And then very quickly, attend meetings, attend candidate forums if they're there, attend any events that may have them. And it gives you, unfortunately, people have to be more active in trying to get this information. They have to take more responsibility than maybe they've had in the past.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially as I think about AI and how can we really believe what we're seeing online. Sometimes the best defense against that is go to the meeting yourself and be active in civic participation in person. Wrap up question as we're kind of drawing our session to a close here. Brianna, let's start with you. I'd like to hear from all the panelists. What's just one takeaway, one concrete tip that you want to make sure people remember as we move through this election cycle?
One is to find out who your local election official is. I think oftentimes it is not always obvious. I live in a county of 185,000 people, and normally that means that the people that live here year-round know where to go for information, but I get 30,000 new students every year in the Mizzou community that I have to re-educate on that. So one of the big things is look, especially if you've moved, look for who your election authority is, if there are any new rules that you need to follow, because laws change all the time. Reach out to them. I encourage everybody too to be a poll worker, because it gives you the most behind the scenes information and also just additional context for working elections. I know that doesn't help with figuring out how to vote and things like that, but what I do often find and hear back from people that are poll workers is that it makes them more invested in the election. And so then they suddenly do find more information because maybe they didn't know that there was information available, or maybe they've never thought about going to a forum in their lives. And now all of a sudden, because they're going to be working the election anyway, they feel obligated to know who the candidates are. So serving as a poll worker or an election judge for your local election official will make them very happy, but will also help you be a more informed voter for the upcoming election.
Alana, what's one takeaway or tip from you?
I would just say be skeptical and think critically when you're looking at these different, flyers and mailers and text that you're getting, and you might not know the source or who's behind it. Just think critically and go to a second source to see if you can, a .gov or some sort of official looking website to be able to, substantiate what you're reading and what you're seeing. It's not easy, and it does take time and bandwidth that we all don't have much of, but it's important to really see what you're looking at, and that would be my one takeaway.
Benjy, how about you?
I was going to say what Alana said about thinking critically and being skeptical. So I'll go a slightly different direction, but it's in the same path, which is take responsibility for yourself and maybe even your family members to make sure that you're informed. And I editorialized for years. I was opinion editor at the Virginian Pilot and at a small non-daily and different things. I editorialized for years about people voting and the responsibility that we have to vote. And it didn't take me long to change that a little bit. I think there is a responsibility to vote, but there's a greater responsibility to be an informed voter. And without people who show up and they're not informed, that's not necessarily helping. So I think if you can take responsibility for being informed, and then maybe those around you, being informed before any of the elections. My 3 children are voting age now, and I learned from them on candidates that they're interested in and all in the process, and I think that's an important part of what we do.
Thank you all. This has been a fantastic discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Brianna, Alana, Benjy. Thank you so much for that rich conversation. If you'd like to learn more about our free election resources from the News Literacy Project, please visit newslit.org. We've got an election landing page with lots of useful links there. Thank you again, everyone. This has been wonderful.